Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 28th of April. Today we're looking at significant changes around the Avdiivka front. Then we'll look at the Krasnohorivka, Chasiv Yar, and Kupiansk fronts. But I want to begin by doing a breakdown of the past 48 hours of events on the Avdiivka sector because there's just been so many developments. We're going to break it down one by one. Starting off with these fields and villages south of Ocheritina, and I explicitly mention Ocheritina because as I've really talked about ad nauseum now, the capture of Ocheritina and the subsequent capture of Avdiivka and Sloviove by the 15th Motor Rifle Brigade, Ocheritina specifically by the 30th Brigade, and then some support from the Arbat Special Purpose Battalion, that has prompted the Ukrainians to face a choice of either holding their line at the current fortified positions near the Durna River, including around northern Semenivka and some of the heights just to the west of it, or to begin the process of withdrawal. And holding on to the line of contact is extremely dangerous given the sustained Russian pressure and continued momentum from the northern flank where the Russians have control over the heights overlooking much of the Durna River Valley. And so the Ukrainians, they began their withdrawal from the remnants of Semenivka that they had under their control a couple of days ago. And by yesterday, it was basically completed in its entirety. And that's when we began to see footage of the 114th Motor Rifle Brigade, a part of the 1st Army Corps DPR fighters. They crossed over either this crossing or this crossing, and they made their way through the houses and solidified control over the entirety of this one road that bisects Semenivka. And this again was verified by geolocated footage over here. We have the Russians again hoisting flags as they do whenever they advance into a new village. And then today the new development was that you had the Russian forces actually reach the western sections of Berdichi. So they finally succeeded in breaking past the Ukrainian defenses that were located basically along the Durna River and its nearby tree lines. So where I have these arrows pointed, eventually the Russian forces got through, and the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade, this unit that was also it was a unit that fought extensively in the Battle of Avdiivka. Now they are again involved in a lot of the heavy frontline combat around Berdichi, and they raised their unit flag in western Berdichi, getting control over the remaining houses the Ukrainians could have used and the remaining basements they could have used as cover within the Durna River line. And that extends to also getting control of these houses that are near this little pond. And in the process of the Ukrainian withdrawal, because if you look at the withdrawal, it was from the Durna River, as I said before. And right now, I would say that a lot of these fields over here in between that are in blue are becoming, they're in the process at least of becoming a gray zone because the Ukrainians could not put a large concentration of infantry squads into such an exposed area. You see there are barely any defensive works set up over here. And that's because the Ukrainians understand that they're not centered in a very well positioned area. And so the Ukrainians have to withdraw at least 5.66 kilometers westwards, and that's where you have the next natural boundary based on paved roads, based on villages that you could use as organizing points. And in the process of that withdrawal, what you'll see is that these fortifications that the Ukrainians built, which you could see are pretty extensive, that are supposed to be defending against a vertical attack across the Durna River towards the village of Umanske, they will become irrelevant. And in the process of withdrawing further westwards, they will be eventually abandoned. And so the Russian forces will have bypassed trying to overcome such a well-built and extensive fortified zone that could have been an issue for them. And so now the Russian forces, they will eventually have the opportunity to advance and get control over the eastern sections of Umanske as the Ukrainians solidify control of the western portions. And so looking at the Ukrainian units that are active, specifically in the area south of Ocheritina and around Umanske, we see that there are a few standout units that are actively involved in a lot of the defending and are now also caught in this pretty significant retreat from their frontline forces. 25th Airborne Brigade, again, I'm not going to repeat them every video, but just so you know. And then you have 61st Mechanized Brigade taken from reserve to, again, get additional infantry to fight on the front lines. Azov, and then you have various other territorial defense units, mainly battalions, some independent regiments, sometimes special forces, police units, 71st Jaeger Brigade, another unit that was moved in recently over the past month or so, and then various drone units. And so on paper, at least, it's supposed to be a pretty large component. But as we saw, the manpower issues that are something that's systematic. It's not just a symptom of a certain unit that suffers from these acute infantry problems. It's something that is definitely plaguing every single Ukrainian unit in this region. Even the ones that have been moved in recently suffer from certain issues, and it's especially compounded for the units like the 47th Mechanized Brigade that we're going to get to in a second, that is fighting to the west of Sloviova right now, trying to contain the Russian advances and prevent them from gaining momentum, pushing westwards towards the rail line and Sokil. Again, a big issue of facing a lack of infantry needed to defend the front line, and then having to go and get sappers, engineers, artillerymen from other components within the brigade and making them fight. And of course, at this point in the war, 2 years in, experience is one of the most important factors for a soldier on the front line. And surely new recruits, people that are just mobilized without prior experience, or people that don't have the proper frontline experience after all this time, then they will be much more vulnerable than the Russian forces in this region. And you could look at the individual units and understand their previous battle experience, whether it be at Avdiivka or beforehand, and there is definitely a mismatch. And so that definitely plays a role in all of the Russian penetrations, and eventually adds up to a larger advance like we saw in Cheratina. And now the Russian forces are consolidating control over Cheratina. It's basically under their full control. They've already slightly pushed westwards, a couple hundred meters westwards along this rail line. There is a paved road that Russian mechanized forces will begin to use, because it's simply too good of an opportunity for the Russians not to take. And I'll, of course, elaborate on that later. But for the Ukrainians, the key thing to do going forward is for their 47th and 100th brigades to hold the line around here. You see this defensive work that I have marked in yellow over here. That is a rather large fortification, and it extends even further south and then connects to, these defenses to the north of Sokil. And so the Ukrainians, they would want to buy time by holding off any sort of Russian armored push or any additional assaults by containing them at this defensive line. If they cannot do that, then the Russian forces will be able to exploit this paved road and the heights on which the rail line is located and flank Sokil and all of its trenches, which will again make them irrelevant, even though when they were built, they were trying, the intention at least, was to defend against head-on assaults. And it will also put the Ukrainian tentative defensive line that is trying to be constructed at the moment in peril. Because if you look at the bigger picture, looking 10 kilometers westwards, what you'll see is that the Vovcha River is the eventual fallback line. But at the same time, there are various floodplains that sort of branch out from the Vovcha River that the Ukrainians would at least hope to utilize before eventually being pushed across the Vovcha. And so one of them is this floodplain over here I'm marking in red, and this is the second one, again located in very low elevation. But if you look at the fields between them, they are actually on local heights. You have hills over there, and then you have even larger hills located on this rail line, which the Russians, if they can advance into this region, would basically put a dent in any sort of Ukrainian plan of a protracted withdrawal over a longer period of time. And so now the current Ukrainian defense line that they are trying to withdraw towards around Novopokrovske and Novosilivka Persha, it is in danger because the Russian forces have control of Solovyove. It gives them a direct route into the defense line or into the hills overlooking the potential defense line marked in the south, or another intermediary defense line around Voskod and Sokil that could actually be set up in the future. And you already have a lot of large defensive works being prepared for that actual scenario. A lot of the defenses that you see marked in yellow on this map, they were built recently, built within the past 4 months in 2024. A lot of them, the majority, were built either in 2023 or during the prelude to the war, but a disproportionate amount have been built in recent months, exactly due to the Russian forces gaining steam in this region and Ukraine starting to anticipate that once Avdiivka fell. And a lot of it has been built nearer to the line of contact. So a lot of the newer defensive fortifications have been built particularly close to the front line, and that's why some of them may not seem as well developed if you zoom in. For instance, these ones that the Russians have not gotten control over, that I'm marking in red, and in the process of getting control over this red rectangle, the Russian forces have gotten control of some of the hills in this region that extend further south. And the Ukrainians, as I said before, the hills that they do still have under their control, which I guess you can mark them in this blue rectangle, they're in the process of withdrawing from them as well. If you look at how they're withdrawing, they could in theory withdraw along this paved route into the center of Umanske. They are withdrawing from Semenivka to Novoselivka parish shell like this. And then of course you have the various open fields. And I do have to mention that earlier today, Russian sources did circulate a claim that a certain amalgamation of Ukrainian troops from a battalion within the 115th Mechanized Brigade and the 104th Territorial Defense Brigade were surrounded at the intersection between Semenivka and Berdichi, and that the commander of that grouping, he was negotiating with Russian forces via cell phone for a potential surrender. Now, that is something that's totally unverified, and there has to be substantial evidence to come to that conclusion. So I'm not going to say that's a fact. What I do know is that already now there have been a few POW videos coming out of soldiers that were captured from the 47th Mechanized Brigade, and that may have occurred when they were trying to contain the Russian assaults a couple of days ago around Cheritina, and just due to the fast pace, some soldiers inevitably would get captured in that same time frame. But honestly, for the most part, the 115th is further north, not really around Semenivka. It's more so around Arkhangelsk. Very hard to pronounce, but whatever. If we look further north, this is where we have some of the more interesting developments from the past 48 hours. So we have this geolocated footage, which is marked at the northern tip of Novokalinove, and it shows Ukrainian tank shelling a Russian reconnaissance force. And that is basically all the confirmation you need that there are already certain Russian forces that have taken over most of the village. And due to the position that they're in, taking the northern tip and flanking whatever forces could be left, Ukrainian forces, I mean, in Novokalinove and Keramik, it means that the fates of those two towns are sealed and that they may already be under full Russian control. So Deep State reported that this assault occurred like earlier today, like beginning of the 27th, or actually they said this was 26th, I believe. But the point is, they say that 20 reconnaissance forces were able to actually enter into this house, and that's at the northern tip. So imagine what's going on along the eastern road over here. The reason why the Russians were successful in their operations around Novokalinova and Keramik is, first of all, because they degraded the Ukrainian forces across the entire line to such an extent that they were able to find a weak point. Because for a very long time now, especially in the beginning of April, the main Ukrainian defensive focus was on the Drina River line and not as much on the rail line positions. Because the Ukrainians had fortifications here, they had the advantage of these various roads that were interconnecting at Novokalinove, and they really reflected this fact by putting in lesser quality units to defend Novokalinove. So for instance, they put in the territorial defense units and various battalions, individual battalions from territorial defense units to hold the line. And the Russian forces, they, instead of assaulting head on, they advanced from the eastern flank. And that's where we saw the first videos of the Russian forces overrunning Ukrainian positions and tree lines on that eastern flank. That very important eastern flank because it's on a height that's overlooking the valleys on which both Novokalinove and Keramik are located. After a back and forth, the Russians solidify control over here. And then they use that as a stepping stone over the past 2 weeks to push into the roads that are located already on valleys in Novokalinove and eventually cut off the supply routes, and then take advantage of the penetration and create a situation where the Ukrainians are basically squeezed out. So any sort of Ukrainian force that is not already withdrawn, they are definitely going to be killed or captured in these two villages. So just looking forward, the Ukrainian positions in Arkhangelsk are also in a similar fate of being enveloped from several directions and being squeezed out, especially when you look at the dynamics relating to elevation. Cheritina, again, totally overlooking Arkhangelsk. Apartment buildings overlooking the supply routes from Kalinova into the village, And then same thing from these heights to the east of Novokalinove. So the Russian forces do have two flanks to begin assaults onto this village. Within the village, you have the 115th, as I said before. You have elements, the 59th Battalion of the 104th Brigade. You have a singular battalion of the Separate Presidential Brigade. And then you have various other territorial defense units coming together to defend that village. But given the swift changes, the Russian forces definitely could continue advancing because the village is only about a kilometer or two away from the line of contact. And there's a lot of questions about what's going on with these defenses just to the south of Arkhangelsk, whether the Ukrainians can even hold on to them because they are in an exposed position. They are very solid defense lines, but only in the case where your flanks are secured. And now, evidently, they aren't, as the Russian forces are pushing along this paved route and could flank it from the east. And so that fortification will have to be abandoned. Something that's more long term but is important to note before I move on is the fact that now the Russian forces have nearly full control of this rail junction, or not a rail junction. No, it's a road, not a rail junction. But whatever. This road, the H20 highway, if you zoom out, you see that it leads to various key Ukrainian positions, various rear cities that are extremely important for the command of the units, coordination between them, sending additional reinforcements and equipment to the line of contact. And on the way, you have Krasnohorivka, and then, of course, the highway goes up to Kramatorsk and Slovyansk and various other major Donbass cities. But the road itself is also important on a local level because it gives the Russian forces a solid route to advance upon to then flank key villages that are currently holding up at the line of contact. One example that I've seen that hasn't been mentioned much is Alexandropol. This is a village that the Ukrainians have held since the beginning of the war. It's a position that is located on rather high elevation, and it's overlooking some of the Russian positions actually in Avdiivka. And so the Russian forces, they definitely could, I'm not saying they can, but that they would, but definitely now that they have the momentum along the H20 highway, a new opportunity is opened up for them to advance along that vector and begin assaults to clear out this Ukrainian forward node. And something that's very important to note is that the Ukrainian troop concentration, basically in between Chasiv Yar and Avdiivka, is relatively light. So is the Russian portion because, again, they're focusing on other parts of the front. But also the Ukrainians seem to be more complacent around here because there are just so many fortifications. It's a difficult area to advance through, but sometimes the Russians have to advance uphill, they have to advance through minefields, and sometimes the rope situation is not that good over here. And so the Ukrainians, they've taken advantage of that and moved forces elsewhere instead of defending over here. But what that means is that you have a very small amount of forces, and the ones that you do have, there are parts of territorial defense units, lesser quality. And so the Russian forces do definitely have an opportunity to exploit this highway over here in order to eventually shape the battlefield in a way that would put New York's western flank in a tricky situation because New York itself is extremely fortified from the eastern perimeter over here, and it is one of those major hubs that the Ukrainians are using to defend Toretsk, which is one of the largest cities they have near the line of contact. And again, this is all a forward shelling zone for the Ukrainians to target an area like Horivka. The Ukrainians, or the Russians, have massively decreased the amount of shelling towards Donetsk city, but in terms of Horivka, there still has to be a lot of work before establishing a buffer zone. So definitely I would look into this area, and you could already see how the Ukrainians have prepared for a potential scenario where they would be pushed back, because you could see how the lines with these yellow trenches have formed along roads that lead into the center of New York. And basically, this defense line that the Ukrainians have sent up just to the north, it's basically 6 kilometers north of where the Ukrainians are currently located. Something very interesting is that Russian sources claim the advance around Novokalinove and Keramik was conducted by the 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade, again, DPR units. This unit was fighting around Mayorske, which is further north. It's also in that New York front area that's relatively lightly manned, and so that unit was moved over to this direction over here. Another thing to mention is that the Russians in reserve on the Avdiivka front do have at their disposal the 90th Guards Tank Division. So here you can see their icon. They have 3 tank regiments and 2 motorized rifle regiments. At least on paper in 2022, it was estimated that they had 300 T-72 tanks. In addition, they had various BMPs and BTR 82s. At least on paper, again, they're supposed to have 10,000 men. I would say about 4,000 of them are infantry based on the two regiments that are supposed to be infantry regiments. And so both the armored component and the soldier component, those can both play a role in exploiting any sort of Russian gains on the Avdiivka front if the Russian forces deem that necessary. So one of these tank regiments has already seen combat, but it was several months ago, and it was, I think, in January, fighting on the northern flank of Krasnohorivka. But since then, there has not been much record of this division. They fought around Kremina, Luhansk front in 2022, if you recall, and now they have not been active for a while. So it would be interesting to see the Russians sending in this exploitative force if they deem it necessary. Something which I don't do much of, but I really should do, is covering additional strikes on equipment from both sides. Something I did a lot in earlier months, but just because of the various changes, I've put it on the back burner. But I do have various geolocated markers to keep track of the equipment losses. So here you have the Varan group from the 100th Brigade. They destroyed and abandoned Russian BMP-2. Then on the other hand, the Russian forces, they also destroyed a Ukrainian piece of equipment. This is from the 115th Brigade. It's a BWP-1. That's a Polish infantry fighting vehicle that was given to that unit. And then in Sloviove, there's a video that came out. I think it's, again, from the Varan group, so they were pretty active around here. They hit 3 Russian soldiers at the bus stop to Sloviove. And then a bit further south, we have one other geolocated video. And it's interesting because it basically shows a Russian drone dropping a grenade onto leaking fuel, which was again leaking from the rear of the actual Marder infantry fighting vehicle. And then it caught on fire and eventually reached again the rear of that vehicle and eventually caused it to burn and suffer significant damage. And so again, we're keeping track of a lot of the vehicular losses over here. It is hard to tell during the fog of the advance which vehicles are on the Russian or Ukrainian side. But I would say that definitely, given the fact that the Russians do have the momentum over here and are advancing on various paved roads, that they are using more vehicles, especially infantry fighting vehicles, to dismount in certain areas. And so inevitably they will have higher losses in that compartment. But that's not to say that the Ukrainians aren't getting hit, especially on the rear. The Ukrainians have suffered some damage to their vehicles. There was another video of a Russian FPV. I think it might have actually not been an FPV, and it was actually a Lancet, but it hit another BMP of the Ukrainian side, and it hadn't even crossed over the Vavch River. So again, you have heavy drone coverage from the Orlan 10s or their different analogs or different variations. So like the Orlan 30 covering the skies over here. Russians have a huge quantity of these reconnaissance drones, and the Ukrainians don't have a cost-effective way to fight back against them through jamming. And again, the Russians in the chips within the UAV, they're already installing these anti-jamming capabilities, so it is improving the way in which they operate and preventing a lot of them from getting down. So again, it's cost effective for the Russians, and it allows them to strike the Ukrainian forces on the rear. Now moving on to Krasnohorivka, the Ukrainians have released several videos confirming Russian advances, but also documenting the Russian vehicular losses. And so there's just this one compilation over here from the Ukrainian side. It shows the Ukrainians destroying a tank with a mine plow, and they did this by targeting it with artillery and FPVs. The video also shows various FPV strikes on Ukraine or Russian soldiers that enter into trenches located in fields to the east of Krasnohorivka, again confirming the Russian push in that direction. And you do have a lot of those FPV strikes on entrances to those trenches, into their underground compartments, drones dropping grenades onto houses, and also Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicles firing towards streets where there are urban battles going on right now. But as I said before, the video does confirm that the Russian forces were able to advance along this particular road that I'm marking with this red arrow. They were able to take over the local gas station and the trench line that runs right next to it, and entrench themselves in the first sections of the Krasnohorivka residential district over here. And so they are already getting control of the houses that are just to the north of this horizontal street. So there are heavy battles going on over there. The Ukrainians are responding with shelling towards the Russian infantry that advance in that direction. Well, the Russian advance itself amounts to about 400 meters. and could definitely be exploited to push even deeper into the Krasnohorivka residential area, which could drive a wedge into the Ukrainian positions that are further east and are within the apartment buildings further west. And at the same time, you do have the Russian infantry that are fighting within the factories, the industrial district, gaining a more solid hold over various buildings. And so the refractory plant, which spans several buildings, it is currently being stormed by the Russians, but they definitely have made advances over the past 24, 48 hours. There's some video footage from the Russian side showing the aftermath of battles, showing an infantry squad of Ukrainian KIA within the building. So that definitely exists. And the Ukrainians no longer have a presence within any of the industrial zone. Any squads they had over there that survived, they made their way further north towards the apartment buildings located over here, which again are formidable positions, but the Russian forces have attrited the Ukrainian defense in this region. And they did it at a pretty quick pace when you think about it, because the battles in Krasnohorivka really only reached their fullest extent, you could say, in recent weeks or maybe about a month ago. So comparing it to other similar sized towns or even smaller towns like Marinka, definitely the pace of the advances of the Russians has been much quicker over here. And that's despite the fact that there have been some reinforcements like the ones from the 80th Air Assault Brigade. And the 80th Brigade, to its credit, it released a video showing an FPV strike on a Russian tank, causing it to get destroyed. And so they are still working with their drone crews to target whatever Russian columns they could. But when you look at the way the defenses around Krasnohorivka were designed, definitely the Ukrainians were trying to maximize the amount of time that it would take to eventually get control of that village and to maximize casualties. You could see that based on how the defenses were built up in multiple layers across terrain that is difficult to traverse just to the east of it. And for the most part, the Russians just bypassed that. And a lot of that is due to the Russian victory on Marinka to the south, which gave them control of a key road that leads directly into Krasnohorivka. And then, of course, they used the rail line. And now, due to the Ukrainian focus that has been centered around the industrial district and residential areas, they have not manned enough troops along these trenches over here to hold onto them. And so the Russian forces have advanced along this trench line, and it's also putting in danger whatever fortifications the Ukrainians have over here where I'm going over with my cursor. A bit further to the east, the Russian forces were able to, again, capitalize on what I just said and get control over this 1.3 square kilometer zone, which includes, of course, a pond, but also you had the Russian forces advancing through some of the roads from Staromykalivka and taking over Ukrainian fortifications that were built in 2014 and built up since then. They took over this area that's colloquially referred to as the Haunting House. It's a formidable Ukrainian stronghold, but didn't really hold that many Ukrainian infantrymen, and so the Russian forces got control of that region, and now it's putting in jeopardy all of the Ukrainian positions on this eastern perimeter of Krasnohorivka, as you can see, and that could again force the Ukrainians out of Krasnohorivka in a shorter period of time by squeezing them from the eastern flank while there's a simultaneous push from the south. And just to remind you guys of the elevation, again, the Russian forces are in control of the southern ridge that runs into southern Krasnohorivka, which they're now getting under their control on a local level. The industrial district, industrial zone in Krasnohorivka is overlooking much of the streets where you had previously residents living, and then Staromykalivka and some of the field just to the east of it, located over here. I'm going over with my cursor. They're also on hills overlooking the valley on which northern Krasnohorivka is in. And the issue with Krasnohorivka is that once that village is passed, there isn't much of a Ukrainian forward node that could be fallen back into that is near the current line of contact. And so by losing Krasnohorivka, the Ukrainians do risk putting in jeopardy their current line of contact, whether it be around Novelske or whether it be around Pervomaiske, where you see recently the Russian forces have been pushing just to the south of Pervomaiske and overrunning some of these trenches, which has put the Ukrainian infantry squads from the 59th Motorized Brigade in danger in this blue square. But in any case, you could see that all of the areas to the west of the current line of contact, they are located on just open fields with a few roads that are leading to the next defense line, which is based around the Avdiivka River as well. And that is several kilometers west. It's about 7-8 kilometers west. And the fall of Krasnohorivka would really prompt an eventual Ukrainian withdrawal to that next line of contact. And that would be very, very close to Kurakove, which has been a Russian objective in the back of their minds throughout all of these operations around Marinka going back years, because Kurakove is a forward shelling base, it's a forward command and control hub, a lot of roads branch out from there. And so, again, this is all a part of Russia's broader strategy in this region. Now, around Ivaniivske, there was this pretty short pause, about a week, where there was just very, very little fighting. Now there's been a slight uptick in the Russian assault. Here, a video from the Ukrainian side showing an FPV strike on a Russian grouping within a house in southwestern Ivaniivske, which led to the squad getting out of the house and then getting killed by Ukrainian small arms fire. If we zoom further out, we see that there was a slight Russian advance along Baba Mountain, because Baba Mountain is this local height which extends to the north of Ivaniivske and then into the forested area to the south of the Canal district in eastern Chasiv Yar over here. And so the Russian forces over the month of April, they've gotten a foothold within, first of all, the mountain and its nearby fortifications, but also within these forested areas where they do have a level of concealment against Ukrainian kamikaze drones that are very pronounced in the sector. And gradually they've been pushing closer and closer to the canal, to the canal line, which would give them a vector to cross eventually, but also a vector to assault the canal district from the south, where recently the Ukrainians have solidified their control, sending in more reinforcements, trying to prolong the amount of time that the Russians have to fight and the casualties they incur before eventually they reach the actual canal line and could begin thinking of Chasiv Yar proper. And lastly, we're looking at the Kupiansk front. I'll just zoom out for a second because I just haven't mentioned this area in a while, so you may not be familiar with it. But if we're looking at the key parts of the Kupiansk front on the line of contact, and that would be this chain of towns over here. I'll mark it with a blue rectangle. And this area, first of all, is located on a key height, but more importantly, it's connected to this highway, which leads directly into the eastern entrance into eastern Kupiansk, like across the Oskil River. And so the Russian forces, for a while now, they've been assaulting Avdiivka and Kyslivka in an attempt to get control over access to this highway. And now they're beginning those operations. I'll explain why I think they're doing it now. But you can see that per deep state and per Russian sources, they were able to advance from the rail line and, 500, 600 meter advance southwards. So they have a presence within Kyslivka, and they're now putting Krasnohorivka in a difficult situation where it's being enveloped from several sides. And the Ukrainian garrison over here is not particularly strong because some of its mechanized forces that were built up in 2023, NATO training, NATO equipment, they've been moved to the Chasiv Yar front. So just coming to mind, there's the 41st and 42nd Mechanized Brigades fighting around here in tandem, then being moved to Chasiv Yar. And then you have the 59th Battalion of the 104th Territorial Defense Brigade. If you recall, it was moved from its defense around the Kupiansk front to defend on the Avdiivka front in recent months. And it is a bit confusing because you also have the 114th Territorial Defense Brigade, so 2 TDF units. That should also tell you about the quality of the forces that are currently holding the line over here. But you do still have some mechanized units like the 88th, and then you have the Kraken unit, which is also pretty strong in its own right. But the point is, in February, I think it was, the Russian forces, they pushed through Avdiivka, broke through the Ukrainian line, got access to the highway in a more pronounced manner, and that extended the Ukrainian line. It forced them to divert reinforcements to fight around Avdiivka and not hold Kyslivka, and then eventually they got extended and troops got rotated out to other parts of the front line. And now you have this opportunity advancing along the heights, taking over the Ukrainian-controlled heights, and now the Russian forces are trying to develop their attacks in a way that would eventually take over Krasnohorivka, because then they have control over this highway. It can advance along the open fields where you have very little Ukrainian defensive coverage all the way eastwards to Petropavlivka, where there you have Ukrainian defenses, but that is still a substantial advance. And so thank you all for watching. Sorry for making this long, not my intention, but see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.